Everybody, my name is Judith Noble, and I'd like to welcome you to one in the series of online talks organized by Pagan Phoenix. We usually run an annual conference. We can't do that this year, so we hope that you're going to enjoy these various online offerings that we're presenting for you. And the theme of today's talk is art and magic, and I'm really pleased to be able to welcome three, I was going to say magical artists who are also magicians or in whose work magic manifests in some way, but they will tell you more about that. So we have Jesse Bransford, who's joining us from New York City. Hello, Jesse.
Hey.
We have Ethan Pennell, who's joining us from Devon.
Hello.
And we have Dominic Shepherd, who's joining us from Dorset.
Greetings.
And I'm going to start by asking each of the artists to show and tell some of their work so that you get more of an idea of what they do. So we're going to start with Jesse. Welcome, Jesse. Over to you.
Great, thank you. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be a part of this as an outsider or an outlier or someone that's not from the Great British Isles. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. It's going to be my website essentially. And hopefully it'll give you, there'll be links to a direction. Can everybody see it? It should have my name up on the top. Great. So I was educated in art school. I went to art school in New York City. I got my graduate degree from Columbia. I did the art school thing. But one of the things that always plagued my process was a sense of meaning and context. And this is not to get into art speak, but meaning is the real rub in a lot of contemporary artwork. And I found my meaning in magic. And knowing that I'm speaking to a magical audience, I think a lot of this iconography is going to be very familiar to most of you. But just to give a quick overview of sort of the threads that I'm pointing myself in, the first one and the most recent one has been a pretty deep exploration of Icelandic and Nordic magical practices, particularly the stave magic or talismanic magic, I think is a general way to put it. And what I've done over the course of many years is make a series of these talismanic drawings. Hopefully you can see the title. The title sort of says it all. They're basically talismanic spells, which again, speaking to a practitioner audience, I know that you know what these are. It was very surprising for the art world to sort of encounter this stuff. I think the blending of the art and magic context is relatively novel, although it's getting a lot of traction right now, which I'm sure we'll be talking about. But this was based off of a deep study of the folk traditions associated with the Norse. And yeah, it's ongoing. These are relatively small drawings. They tend to be very much like most talismanic magic. They tend to be mobile and movable and pretty compact. But I have done work that is at greater scale, and that will take me back to, we'll basically just go up in scale and backwards in time. I've also done have a long-standing yoga practice that has pointed me to the visual iconography of the Indian and Hindu magical traditions. Most recently, I completed a suite of 10 drawings that were exhibited around of a feminine aspects of the divine called the Mahavidyas. Very, very powerful stuff, very intense stuff, and couldn't be much more different from the Icelandic traditional milieu, although I have found that there is a deep sort of underlying current that connects all of this material. I don't so much believe in a messianic sort of perennial wisdom as much as I do the sort of omnipresence of our circumstances, human beings. So I think that culturally speaking, a lot of this stuff has overlaps, and the power is coming from a very, very similar place. The third sort of big category, which is really where I started, and I think is probably most, well, actually, who knows who I'm talking to, is the Western magical tradition. in particular the work of Cornelius Agrippa, the 3 books of occult philosophy, which to my mind is the sort of one of the original encyclopedias of the Western canon of magic. It was a real revelation when I discovered it about 25 years ago. I was in a residency in France and having a real crisis of faith about art and artwork, and discovered the writings of the author Frances Yates, who in several of her books relies pretty heavily on Agrippa's work, as well as people like John Dee and Giordano Bruno. So I did a series of work, and what we're looking at right now is the moon. And all of this work, it spans over about a 10-year period of me sort of doing a survey of each of the planets of antiquity. This is, again, is the moon. We'll give you another smattering of some of the others. Let's see, where do we go? Let's do Jupiter. One of the things I was really interested in, and I sort of touched on it, is this idea of cultural syncretism, this idea of magic crossing boundaries, both cultural, magical, phenomenological, you name it. And I think that the planet cycle, which again started in around 2005 and went to about 2015, really sort of gave me a wide sort of context from which everything else has come. That is a pretty good oversight or overview of what I've been up to for the past 10 or so years. I would do a quick plug. I did a book a couple of years ago. This is the deluxe edition with Folger. Folger is the great British occult press. And I did a book of the Book of Staves, which is available through Folger and also through DAP, which is an arts publishing network. It's called The Book of Staves. I'm quite proud of it. And I think if you have an interest in the material or are interested in what I'm doing, it's a good place to go. Now, I'm going to switch tabs, and someone yell at me if the tab doesn't change. I'm a teacher also. I teach at NYU, and this is actually how I met Judith and Dominic, who I've met previously. And Ethan, it's a pleasure to meet you digitally. But this is a network that we founded with Folger called the Black Mirror Network, and it's an affiliation, a research network between Arts University Bournemouth, which essentially Dominic is the representative, NYU Steinhardt, which is me, Plymouth College of Art, which is Judith, Folger Press is the publisher. And we've done a series of peer-reviewed journals that are we're quite proud of, I think, and are always looking to expand the network through proposals for our publication. Our publications roughly every 2 or so years. The pandemic has kind of thrown us really off of our ideal schedule. But I'd encourage everybody that has academic or does rights to consider proposing something for the Black Mirror Network. Again, the address, if you can't see the URL window, it's blackmirror.network, and it's a good resource and a good connection point for a lot of these shared interests. That's the 5-minute mark, and I'm going to try to turn off my presentation by doing stop presenting, and I thank you for your time, and again, I really look forward to this conversation. So, thanks.
Thank you, Jesse. That's great. We're going to come back to some of those themes for sure in a little while. Next, I'd like to introduce Ethan Pennell, who's going to talk a little bit about his work. Ethan, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Judith. So I'm going to share with you several artworks, many of which have been inspired by the folklore of Dartmoor in southwest England, where I live. So I'm going to go into presentation mode now.
Got it.
Okay, so the first image is entitled The Brothers Who Saw Themselves. Watching in the church porch was a widely known tradition throughout Britain, usually held on St. Mark's Eve, April the 24th, or in the case of this story from Tavistock, Devon, Midsummer Eve. It was based on an ancient belief that if you looked through the church door keyhole at 12 o'clock on this night, you would see all those who were to die that year walk into the church from the opposite doorway. And during the late 19th century, two brothers spent Midsummer Eve doing just that and saw themselves in the funeral procession. They both died soon afterwards. Now, this scene was created in the 1970s doll's house that I possess, and it represents a dwelling near Bovey Tracy, a small town on the edge of Dartmoor, which was once haunted by a procession of phantom monks. They were seen passing up and down the staircase at the same time every evening until the place was eventually exorcised. And the staircase had once belonged to Buckfast Abbey, and on the backs of some of the treads were the carved names and initials of the monastery's former inhabitants. This image, also created in the doll's house, is about Parson Harris on the right, an 18th century conjuring parson and wizard from Hennock, a village on the eastern border of Dartmoor. Conjurers use magic spells to invoke and control spirits. By the 1600s, they were much in demand, not only to lay ghosts, but also to cure specific diseases, find lost property, and even predict the future through astrology. In this scene, the parson has gone one better and time-travelled to the 1970s, where he confronts two particularly lively ghosts haunting a semi-detached property in the suburbs of Plymouth. He is equipped with his trusty copy of Agrippa's fourth book of occult philosophy, the Robert Turner edition, a popular grimoire amongst the 18th and 19th century English cunning folk. This is called the Occult Cafe, and it depicts a bunch of mostly famous Western esotericists, alchemists and the like hanging out in a cafe. How many can you name, I wonder? The witch hare. There are several towns of witches shape-shifting into hares and back again in the Dartmoor area, the rest of Britain and beyond. The Toad Witch. During the 1860s, an infamous witch lived in North Bovey, a village situated on the southeastern side of Dartmoor. She was locally feared for her occult use of toads, a dozen or so of which were kept in a pan under the kitchen sideboard. They were often taken to the local churchyard at midnight for black magic rituals. The wished hounds of Wissman's Wood. Wissman's Wood is supposedly one of the most haunted places on Dartmoor, where the wild hunt is said to emerge at midnight, led by Alder Dewar, the local name for the devil, who is accompanied by the wished hounds, a ferocious pack of phantom black dogs with fiery red eyes. So Dartmoor has long been the devil's playground. Even the great thunderstorm of October the 21st, 1638, which severely damaged Widdicombe Church, was blamed on him. So in the left-hand image, the devil arrives in Widdicombe to claim the soul of Jan Reynolds, a ne'er-do-well who had made a pact with him many moons ago. And the devil, or evil rider, as he's referred to in this tale, tethered his steed to a pinnacle of the church tower before plucking Jan from the pew where he'd fallen asleep. Accompanied by peals of thunder, he flew off with him up through the roof of the church, breaking the pinnacle of the tower in his haste to get away. In the right-hand image, the devil is seen looming over St. Michael's Church on Brent Tor, ready to do battle with the church's patron saint, who eventually vanquished him. The Lichway. So this was painted on an old cloth map of Dartmoor, and it refers to an ancient corpse road along which the dead were once carried for many a grueling mile to be buried in Lidford on the western edge of the moor, a practice that lasted up until 1260. And in more recent times, there have been numerous sightings of phantom funeral processions and monks dressed in white on this track, threading their way through the mist. So this image represents the ghost of Sir Francis Drake. He haunts Dartmoor and the old road linking Tavistock to Plymouth. He rides in a coach drawn by headless horses, accompanied by a demonic host and headless black dogs, perhaps as punishment for his involvement in the slave trade whilst alive. Old Crochan. He's the guardian spirit of Dartmoor, and on dark, stormy nights, he emerges from Crochen Tor, riding a skeletal horse and wielding a sword, ready to smote anyone or anything that stands in his way. Old Uncle Tom Cobley and all was inspired by the famous song Widdicombe Fair. The Devon folklorist Theo Brown described the grey mare in the song as an otherworld psychopomp, transporting the dead to the afterlife. And here we have a dwarf and a goblin, two of the many fairy denizens that dwell on Dartmoor. This particular dwarf haunts a lane in Chudley Knighton on the eastern fringes of the moor and points towards buried treasure. The goblin used to be seen sitting on the Bishop's Stone in Lussley Village, also on the eastern side of Dartmoor. And finally, I sometimes describe this creature as a witch owl, or the Cailleach, who is associated with owls and known in Gaelic as the crone of the night. And if you're interested in my work, you can follow me on Instagram, Crowman Crow, and check out my Etsy site, which hopefully will be up and running by the time you see this. Thank you.
Ethan, thank you very much. That's great. And our last presentation before we get to chat is from Dominic Shepherd. Welcome, Dominic, and over to you.
My name's Dominic Shepherd, and as you can see from this first image, I live in the woods of Dorset, which is very much kind of an area that feeds into my work. My actual location, I'm very much somebody who paints my life, I suppose, and how it's lived. This painting here came about, it's actually my daughter, as I saw a show called in Germany about the artist as prophet, as visionary. And it started to make me really think about my work. I've always been concerned with the kind of magical and the kind of the imagery of magic in the work. But this started to make me really think about making work that was magical, that I actually invested it with some kind of purpose or intent, dare I say, to make it work. So in a way that I wanted it to be divinatory, to work as oracle. At the time where I was living was under threat. This woodland, this very special place that I live, this place and my family, and that kind of reflected into wider kind of political and social concerns. The other thing is I work very intuitively, and so I'm not always sure why I make the images I make. It's like the choices I make come through either through vision or through working, through play, through automatic drawing. It's more that things feel right. And usually a lot of the things are in hindsight that I kind of look back and start to understand what it is that's actually happening on a kind of psychological, a social, a cultural, historical, and a kind of magical layers. I make a lot of this work by actually enacting things out. Here I am crawling into a stream, so I will go through sometimes, or put my family through a kind of sense, not just of theatre, but maybe of ritual, to come up with the imagery, which then I'll photograph and draw and use these as the basis for the paintings. I got very interested in water in the last show that I did. I show a lot in a gallery in London called Charlie Smith. You can find me if you Google Dominic Shepherd. I'll turn up and you can find routes to me. I got very interested in water and aspects of water as a kind of not just some psychological kind of layer and a painting layer, but a magical layer as well, to do with surface, to do with reflection, and to do with the depth underneath, and the figure is something that can break through these kind of layers, kind of as above, so below, but also this middle layer, this thin nimbus, this kind of way, this strata that can be broken. Over lockdown, I've been doing a series of watercolors. I've done 52 so far. For something called Project Papyrophilia. And it's really kept me kind of alive. It's nearly been like a diary of my thoughts and kind of thinkings that I've been doing over that time. And so that's been really kind of enjoyable way of kind of dealing with it and with it, as I said, with my kind of life that I live here in the woods. And recently also I've been working with Judith and Ethan on a project, which you might get into, and this is part of that. And I think it shows on my ways of working. I've been walking. I do a lot of what I would call kind of negative capability, or kind of intuitive walking, just what I see, and sometimes putting myself into a state before walking with this one, and then letting things occur to me, letting the kind of the world influence me and show me, reveal to me, an act of revelation, really, that this work can be seen to be. Great. Okay, I think I'm going to finish there, and we will now turn to the conversation. Thank you very much indeed. Right.
Dominic, thank you very much. So there we have an introduction to everybody's work, and I'm really fascinated and cheered by the idea now that we can talk about art which is not illustrating magic but is itself magically inspired and magically made, and that's a really big difference, and one that I think is increasingly important. So I wondered if that was a good place to start, maybe to just talk a little bit about the role that magic plays in the making of the work, and I think probably the idea that for all of us working this way, the magic and the art are indivisible. You can't really separate them. Is that a good place to start?
Yeah.
That's a big one.
I've definitely got thoughts about it. Yeah. So, but Jesse, do you want to, or Ethan?
I mean, I could ramble on about it. I mean, I sort of, in my presentation, I sort of alluded to the idea of like the creative process for me having like a conflict in it, or being somewhat sort of pulled in weird directions regarding it. I think a lot of it has to do with the school I went to, the way I was educated, and the context, being in a very commercial environment, New York City, et cetera. My sort of initial experiences of artwork were as commerce. And this was a real problem. And I don't think it really has that much to do with creativity. So, but for me, in my experience, it made art difficult in a way that I didn't think it needed to be. So I was always looking for ways to sort of talk myself out of doing art the way I had been taught to do it. And it wasn't until I discovered magic initially as a metaphor. And I talk about this a lot. Like, I think metaphor is a really powerful way of getting at crossing bridges between disciplines and so forth and so on. But I started using magic as a metaphor for what I felt was behind the creative process. And then over the course of sort of self-initiating, self-educating, learning more about it, I realized that it's kind of the same thing. And so for me, the creative process is coming from the same wellspring that magic in the different traditions, as I understand it, are coming from. So in a way, it's like the terms have collapsed, like the creative and the magical have sort of become one for me. And that was a real breakthrough moment that I'm always trying to remind myself of when I'm trying to make work.
Yeah.
Ethan, do you want to add anything at this point?
Yes, so my work is certainly inspired by magic, and there's also a magical process at work. I visit the sites that I'm sort of inspired by and tune into the spirit of place, genius loci. So that's a really important aspect in my work. And also I have a sort of artist alter ego called the Crow Man, and I sometimes dress up as him. So if you do see a strange creature roaming Dartmoor, looking a bit like a plague doctor, it could be me. And so often if I'm sort of stuck, I'll ask myself, what would the Crow Man do? So he kind of is there to sort of guide me in the process.
Dominic.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to kind of, because I think it's a really interesting one, that point of change. Because I went, like Jesse and probably Ethan, I went through an art, and yourself, Judith, I went through an art school system in the 80s and even through the 90s, and you could not mention magic and art. If you did, you could be laughed at. It was a kind of a very kind of dangerous area to touch on. This kind of sense of objectivity and coolness. and the sense of the kind of subjectivity of magic was a kind of area that was difficult. So, and during the 90s, when I was kind of making paintings and stuff like that, and I lived in London at the time, and people would just laugh. I mean, sometimes they would just laugh. I was kind of mixing around with what was then called the kind of YBAs and young British artists, and they just thought I was a bit of a joke. There was this funny guy who painted fantasy paintings, and to mention magic was very difficult. And it was when I came down to the woods, actually, it's actually when I escaped the big smoking city and came down to Dorset, that something kind of happened within my head at that point, and a kind of revelation happened, I suppose. This understanding of re-enchantment of the world and this allowance of the enchantment, and actually that I was living it, that I was kind of in it, and that became stronger and stronger with the work until I came, as I said, to the work that I made for the show Barefoot Prophet, where I said, no, these works, I want them to be magical works. I'm going to make something so they have an effect. I don't even know what it's going to be, but I'm going to kind of intent to put that into the work. And it was to do with actually the act of making them, not just the imagery, but it was actually, as I was making them, the thought of the making the marks, that thing that we have with painting, we talk about going into the flow, whatever, was that became a magical act, and seeing it as a magical act. The creation of it became something very important. Yeah.
If I can just add a really quick comment that's just so similar to my own experience. I think at that point where, you know, the art world refused to recognise magic, I just turned my back on the art world, carried on doing the same work, but didn't call it art anymore and just did it in a different milieu. And I think what's been very interesting is the way that in the last few years the circle has turned, and suddenly those of us who've been doing that work for a long time, you know, like everybody here present, finds that the art world is interested again. That may prove to be a double-edged sword, but there you go. Right, I'm not going to say any more. Just chip in, everybody.
Well, I want to add to this and connect some of what Dominic was saying to some of the things that I read on Ethan's website, which was actually a really great thing to look at. Ethan, on your website, you mentioned new materialism. And I think that so much of what I experienced in art school, and again, I don't think this needs, I'm not trying to make this a critique of the art school model. I think it's endemic to the way that Western civilization has sort of made these different bins that you put things in for categories and for, for depth understanding. But there are a lot of false dichotomies out there. And I think the new materialists in particular, I'm most familiar with Gross's work. But it's like this idea of these false binaries, this or that, or this is this and that is that. I think magic, again, even if we're just thinking metaphorically, is such a good way of thinking interdisciplinarily, right? It breaks down these boundaries. And that was the thing that really disappointed me in a lot of my art classrooms was, oh, that's not art, that's illustration. Oh, that's not art, that's craft. And I think that one of the things that's happened over the last, 20 plus years, certainly no small part because of, our presence in these institutions, has been to break that down a little bit. And I think that magic is and it is a double-edged sword, which we can talk about as well. But on the positive side, I think it's been really useful to sort of bring traditionally, separated spaces into the same environment.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I've always felt there was a link between art and magic. You think of Coleridge, he talks about an imaginal consciousness, and that is that place, isn't it, where the creative goes, where the creative gets intuition and inspiration for the work. And I think that's fundamental.
Yeah,
it's always the poets, right? The poets always get it. They're always like furthest on the limb in the humanities, and they are always like right there when you make the revelation.
Yeah. And the filmmaker Maya Deren, who you probably know, I've studied quite a lot, and she said the job of the artist was to voyage into the other world and collect these treasures of knowledge and then bring them back into this world in a form and put them in a form that could be communicated to other people, which that kind of suits me as a sort of mission statement in some ways, I think.
Yeah. No, it's interesting just in my capacity of being an artist, but like Jesse and Judith and Ethan as well, we all work within the kind of teaching field, and dealing with students now, and how I as I said, still I know people have other staff members have difficulty with methods and methodologies, or how I might what I'll try to place in the students, and in a way to kind of liberate them sometimes and say, look, there isn't a right or wrong way, but this is a way that you can go forwards. You can think about work in a very different way. I talk about intent, talk about the intuitive, talk about the romantic, and say that these are ways of making work. And this as I said, the art school still very much, and I think we're talking about the art school, I don't want to get too much involved in the art school, but also the art world has this kind of way that it wants to, theoretical frameworks demand something that somehow they can hold on to, and I think they feel very worried if something starts to get a bit nebulous or not understood on a nearly a text-based purpose, or through words. It's understood on a very another level, which is that magical level, or a level of enchantment, maybe.
Absolutely.
And maybe we also have to remember that the audience for this work is not necessarily just that audience, that there's a much wider audience for it. I know Ethan showed some work at the Pagan event last year, and I think that was very, very well received, because it was very, very easily, in a good way, accessible. So remembering that the magical audience has always been there, and is a lovely, loyal sort of tribe to be part of. It really is a good thing. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's, again, one of the first false dichotomies I broke down was this notion of craft. And I mean, a lot of magical practitioners refer to what they do as the craft. And I think that it's a much less civilized in the sense of, like, it doesn't have these superstructures that Dominic's talking about. It's about just like the raw experience of like working with material. I think poets get it. I also think ceramicists, like people that work with clay, really get it. And I tend to, like, thinking about my experience of like places in the arts where magic was always there quietly doing its thing, whether or not the institution was paying attention. Is the ceramic shop and, like, the quad where the poets were doing their stuff. It's kind of amazing, actually.
I'm wondering if it might also be a good idea to talk about the role that place and location plays in everybody's work. I know that Dominic and Ethan have touched on that, and you're both really closely rooted in a particular landscape, and Jesse's also been rooted in various landscapes, and it's become a bit of a commonplace to talk about the idea of genius loci or spirit of place, but there is a real profound strength to that I think is one of the ways that magic operates. So I don't know if anybody would like to think about that, about place and location.
For me, it all sort of happened whilst I was living in southeast London, and it was a lifesaver, really. I became immersed in local folklore, and as a result, I experienced a deep sense of belonging, moving from a state of disconnection to one of rootedness. And that's what inspired me then to move somewhere else and sort of try it in a sort of rural setting. So moving to the edge of Dartmoor over a decade ago, that feeling of connectedness deepened, and I haven't stopped since.
And you now range over that territory, and you're kind of mapping that territory, and the work is made out in the landscape, or how does that work? How's the relationship of being in the landscape translating into the work you make?
Oh, it's essential. It starts by going to the places, and as I mentioned earlier, just tuning into the spirit of the place, getting a feel for it, and then going back and calling in the Crow Man and conjure up. And for me, there's definitely, Dominic mentioned enchantment earlier, and I think that's the key word for me. It is about, or re-enchantment. I'm sure, you know, as we all are, really concerned about what's going on environmentally. And for me, this is one of my ways of sort of dealing with that. It's sort of telling stories about the local landscape, and hopefully reaching out to some people maybe who hadn't thought about venturing out there. You know, just finding a more playful way of connecting people to the locale.
I'm following on, you know, and then I think, you know, Jesse's in, you know, over the pond, so it's quite an interesting thing. But I'm aware I am a bit like Ethan, you know, moving from London down to where I am in Dorset. It's I live in an old kind of parkland. Jesse's been here, Judith's been here, and which is very particular. It's been through many changes in its time. It's part of a kind of feudal estate, and now it's gone back to the wild. And we live in the middle of 90 acres, and there's lakes and weirs, and it's very wild. So I spend a lot of time kind of crawling or kind of disappearing into the landscape. There is a kind of nearly kind of becoming one with it. You go into a sense of trance, staring at things for a long time, just really immersing, where I'm not quite sure where I stop and the landscape starts to begin. I like that idea of you know, the embodiment in the mind. You know, when I look at something or when I'm in something, and the sound and the environment, I then become it, and it becomes me. And this experience of where I am then is what informs the work. And it's not always I kind of depict that experience, but those moments, and I think they are interesting about poetry. And I was going these very kind of poetic moments of kind of complete, everything just shifts and changes, and they are revelation. I think, you know, interesting about the idea of work being revelation or vision rather than something which you thought up, a kind of concept. It kind of comes upon you, and I think that's a really important way of me working with the area I'm in. And really is this. I've been here now 20 years, and really the work has revolved around these 90 acres of just constant exploring and re-exploring. And of course, seasonally, I'm very lucky. Just today, amazing day. But it's very sunny here, Jesse. The sun has come out finally, but it really seasonally has a massive effect as well. I think it's a very important part of the work. I find my work changes over the year drastically depending on the kind of seasons, the way that I operate within this place, within this certain area. There's another thing that I'm going to pass to Jesse before I go on, because there's something else I could bring up. But Jesse, I'm going to pass to you with place.
Oh, I mean, it's something that I've talked about with Judith and Dominic, because I've been to both of one of the things, my universal experience of the UK has been a generosity, first of all, and, you know, I can just go on and on about that. But you all have a very, very different relationship to place, and it's hard to put into words. But I think the easiest way to say it would just be that, like, you know, to the extent that my relationship to the land that I'm living on is that of essentially a colonizer. And most of us here haven't been here for more than a generation. And it's felt. I mean, it's kind of the way, like, you know, the mythology of America really has, like, baked into it this whole idea of, like, oh yeah, the new, the unexplored, the whatever, which of course is finally being rewritten because, you know, there were people here before. But my whole youth was really not about place at all. It was about people. So my relationship to place as it's emerged, it's funny because, like, that relationship has really been born out of travel. So it's a different, it's not a rootedness, it's a displacement almost. And it wasn't until about 5 years ago I bought a house in upstate New York, and I'm finally starting to get some of that experience that Dominic was just alluding to, and Ethan, you were alluding to as well, of, like, that there's something special about this place. There's something that, you know, there's a relationship to place and time that happens when you stay in the same environment. So, I mean, I didn't really notice the season cycle as a person until I was, like, over 40. And that it's kind of fascinating. And it's something that I think magic has really brought me to in a lot of ways. Judith.
Yeah. Yeah, yes, I suppose we're all sort of looking a bit sideways at you because maybe maybe we've got so used to that experience of living the seasons, but then in another way, I think we just have to really think, well, that actually, in some ways, although we've all chosen to do that, and it's not been easy economically or in any other way, we are privileged to have been able to do that.
We're fortunate.
We are fortunate. So,
and I think coming on to that places thing, and I think, I'm just saying that, the work I've kind of done and things like that, and I did a show called Old England, and things like that, actually kind of questioned the nature of place as well. My own, my kind of, as I said, my romanticism and my kind of love of place and this thing, but also sometimes my fears of that love of a particular thing, and the flag that one waves and the boundaries one makes and the privileges that one then holds because of that. And I think that's something I could discuss in talks that I know we've done with Judith and Jesse and things like that at conferences. But that there's a kind of dichotomy. There's I don't want to use that word binary to say not about binary, but there's always this this thing that one way is what I kind of love, and the two with my awareness. As Goya said, that the death of reason brings forth monsters. It's that way that if you sometimes go too far that way, you can descend into something which becomes about exclusion and possession. So
I just wondered though that some of the work that you showed us at the beginning, Jesse, and the book that you made, you'd managed to take yourself to a completely different location on the globe, Iceland, and get very involved with meeting the spirits of that place. So I wondered if you might like to just explain a little about that, because it fascinates me. I don't know how I would be able to do something like that.
Well, I think it goes back a little bit to what I was saying about like discovering like a sense of place for me was about a displacement, or was about going outside. I was going to make a comment, and maybe I'll circle back around to it. But when I went to Iceland for the first time, I was just struck by like how elemental it is, and actually the places that have had the strongest effect on me were not about the people. It was about the everything around the people, right? And I think like it may not be place that I've like gravitated to as just a different relationship to time. And I think like when we talk about place, if we think about it from like a non-hominid specific like point of view, plants and trees, and Dominic, I have a very vivid memory of you taking me to the tree that you know best on that piece of property you're talking about. And Ethan, it's very clearly a part of your work. You must go back to these places. And it's not so much about like the actual XY Cartesian location. It's about the spirits of the things that are there. And I mean, we can be, I'll start like with a narrow expansion, and then we can go all the way out on it. But like, we know that plants communicate with each other. We know that like animals have like, deep interconnectivities that, while not linguistic, certainly are about a kind of a working out and a collaboration, whether or not it involves like eating or being eaten or not. But I think these trees in particular, it's like I've gotten to know, it's the season cycle, but it's through the lens of trees, or through the lens of plants, who don't have the mobility necessarily that I have, but they have like a different viewpoint. And for me, that's really been I think like another way to talk about magic is sort of this, ways of crossing boundaries. And I feel like my location of place in upstate New York and seeing the season cycles and experiencing them, anyone can experience it, but to have a non-trivial experience, it revolves around like, making the point of trying to see it through a different lens. And I think like it's present in everybody's work that I know of that's here today, of this kind of notion of like there's a perspective other than the human perspective that like has a valid voice. And I think everybody can go with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's key for my work. You mentioned earlier new materialism, so about that interconnection between the human and the non-human. So for me, the spectral landscape, the other world, is also very important. And so there's that sense of being earthed, but also a connection to otherness. And I'm also interested, you mentioned displacement, Jesse. There's a group called the Dark Mountain Project. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them.
I know the Dark Mountain Project.
Yeah. And they're sort of focusing on ecological collapse, really, and accepting that that's what's going on. So there's a sense of grieving for mass extinction and stuff like that. But they've just asked artists and writers to contribute to their new journal, and it's about extractivism. I think that's the right term, but not so much the sort of economic, sort of social to political stuff, but more about how this ecological crisis is affecting the non-humans, the spirits of place, that sort of thing. So I think there is that sort of dark underbelly, which, and you mentioned this, Dominic. It's not all about sort of how wonderful the spirit of place is. There is this sort of underside, this other element, which has obviously an ecological side to it. But I don't know. It's you're sort of in the shadows as well.
Yeah.
That's really important, because then you've got to respect what you're working with. So it's not always a good place.
Yes, it's not a merry little stroll through the forest. And I think the idea Jesse identified of how shifting ourselves out of the perspective of human time as well is very important in this work. And probably Ethan and Dominic will know that my work seems to have been becoming more and more engaged with geology and the life of rocks, and understanding those as living non-human beings but operating in a very different way from the way that we do. And so I think there's also so many ways in which that maybe there's a point at which time and space aren't relevant distinctions when you step into the other world.
Pull back that veil, yeah.
And also interestingly, time and space or something, within coming back to the kind of creativity or artistic experience, even making the ceramics, there's a certain point that time and space it changes. And I think there's something in the act of creativity or maybe, even going down to filmmaking, it changes that very time and space. It's a way creativity somehow, and I think that's what's wonderful about it, is it somehow allows that kind of way of experiential or experience of what we're talking about, this squashing or changing of time and space, to actually happen through the creative act, through the act itself, and then what may actually be the outcome of it that then starts to be able to play it back. It's a way of actually communicating this really, this experience which it can't be put into words, really. It's very difficult to articulate otherwise.
Well, I think that's to sort of circle back around again to this notion of art education, I feel like that's the thing that we're constantly dealing with too, is this notion of there being an experiential palette that has nothing to do with language. It has nothing to do with, it's the font by which creative language and creative languages emerge, but in order to work with those, you have to recognize that there is something like sort of phenomenological, for lack of a better word, or something like, something beyond words that is constantly coming at us. And I think it has a darkness as well as a brightness. And I tend to be shiny happy just because I'm actually a closet pessimist.
No.
Yeah. I think that underbelly is definitely something that we haven't confided in enough, and if that makes any sense. I think there needs to be a recognition of it in a way as well.
Yeah. But it's I suppose it's that word underbelly, isn't it? And I think it's a kind of difficult word. Dark and light, and those sort of things, and our sense of darkness. And is darkness necessarily, as we say, I don't want to put it in simple moral terms. Somehow we talk about these binaries kind of wrong, and I think that's the thing, is that darkness isn't. It isn't. It's extremely necessary, and it's. I remember kind of interesting reading the book about Entangled Lives by Merlin Sheldrake. I made a lot of work about 15 years ago all about fungus and mushrooms. The big show called Mycelium, I remember, and it's like that fact that under the earth is this kind of strands, this whole network that you can't see that communicates. It lives in the dark. It lives off dead matter. Decay is part of things reforming and life again. And I think it's this, this darkness is actually extremely necessary. And I think we kind of get this kind of moral imperative, or there seems to be this maybe religious moral imperative that somehow there should be a moral way put on it. And sometimes it's like, well, no, that's fitting the wrong thing. It doesn't fit. These things don't fit. It's putting something on the top. It's trying to layer something, some structure on something which doesn't necessarily require that.
So this is going beyond all those binaries again, because I find that although many pagans and magicians will talk about the idea of the dark and the light, and will engage with the darkness, but very often it's still in terms of those binaries. So I suppose that one of the great contributions of the goddess spirituality movement of feminism is to talk about darkness in a different way, to talk about darkness as not the bad place, but the necessary space, I'd put it, the necessary space between incarnations, or in common parlance, the womb and the tomb, and those things are essential. They're not... we can't avoid them, but their importance to the whole of life and non-life is what we should be thinking about, maybe. So how do we deal with that in the work? I know that Ethan's work connects a lot with ideas around what's behind death and being out of incarnation, and how do the living manage to express that, and that the folklore has been an important way of doing that. I don't know if you wanted to maybe say something more about that. A lot of your work is about that space beyond life. The living try and look in,
Yeah, I think I just feel very privileged to be able to sort of explore that in my work. It's as Dominic said, that there isn't that sort of, for me, there certainly isn't that sort of binary approach. So I always sort of feel I'm in this liminal place. I think a lot of us do. We sort of walk in between worlds, and I guess that's a big part of, so certainly the work I've been doing with our collaborative group, sort of working with Judith and Dominic and some other people, and I've just produced a sort of tourist guide to the other world. So I've been sort of looking at how folklore have dealt with death, and what is this place that we are meant to go to? And I kind of see it. I kind of do see it. It's not all about. Yeah, I mean, there is death as such, but, the fairy world was traditionally a place that was populated by pixies and elves and whatnot, but also our ancestors. So I find that concept really interesting. They sort of really mixed it up, and I'm trying to sort of reclaim that, and maybe open up a new approach to looking at all of this stuff. So I'm still exploring it.
Okay.
There's such a rich history of that as well. I mean, every year or so I go and visit a community in Western New York called Lilydale, and it's one of the American spiritualist communities. And it's a fascinating, it's fascinating too, because, and again, this is my sort of interpretation, but their currency is also metaphorical, because part of what they, in order to be a member of the community, you have to be a registered medium, which means you have to be able to communicate with the the spirit world. And and then they in turn sort of like render service to people who can't. And so there's this really interesting notion, and I've met and become friendly with several mediums in that community, and it's this notion of the metaphor, and they're always battling with it because, like, you know, it's a nominally Christian community, but they all recognize that that's one facet of like a much larger sort of spectrum, and that they have to calibrate like their audience in this really weird way. And I think that to me is fascinating. And it also underlies a lot of what I've been thinking about in this conversation, which is, the space that we're talking about of magic or of the magical is you know, it outclasses like our consciousness by such a great like factor. I mean, we're using tools of like, you know, we're trying to talk to plants. We're trying to like become tuned with these larger cycles. And it's like one of the big recognitions for me is just how, it's bigger than all of us. And it's kind of beautiful in a way.
I think that's great. I mean, we are rapidly approaching the end of our time. So I was just going to ask everybody if there was anything concluding that they wanted to say. I mean, we've traveled a long way in space and time in this, and Jesse, I think that was a great.
I'm not going to get better than that.
That was great.
Nathan, would you like to say anything else in conclusion before we wrap?
No, I think I'm good, thank you. Yeah, still in the other world somewhere.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank all three of you for what's been a really interesting discussion. And I hope maybe something that we'll all be able to keep thinking about and will lead to other things. I think something that I've noticed as we've been talking is very interesting is that we could have had this conversation amongst magical practitioners per se. We happen to be having this conversation as magicians, the outcome of whose magic is art. But I think the identification between that practice and the magical seems to be pretty complete. And I think that's a very cheering thought. So I'd like to thank you all very much. Thank you, guys.
Thank
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're a privilege. Thank you.
And